Okay, the meeting of the Rent Control Board is hereby called back to order after a closed session. Please join me in a salute to our flag. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, if anyone wishes to address the board on either on a specific agenda item or a public comment, if you haven't already, please fill out a speaker slip with the secretary over here. Now up, would the general counsel please report on the closed session of both April 1st and tonight's closed session meetings?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Commissioners. The board met in closed session on April 1st and April 10th and adjourned with no reportable action taken. And that concludes my report. Thank you.
Thank you. If commissioners have had an opportunity to review the minutes from our previous meeting on March 13th, may I have a motion for their approval? Commissioner Leslie?
I move that we accept the minutes as so purported.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Leslie and seconded by Vice Chair Ivanov. And can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Dudek,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
and Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. All right. Item 6, special agenda items. Does the Executive Director have anything to report to the board?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners, and members of the public joining us tonight. First, I look forward to welcoming Brian Augusta a little later this evening. He's the board's legislative lobbyist, and Brian will be updating the board on the 24-25 legislative session. In addition, the board will receive the 2024 annual report, a very thorough and well-organized encapsulation of where rent control in Santa Monica stands through the close of 2024. I would like to thank Public Information Manager Dan Costello for his cross-departmental leadership and all of the staff that participated in putting this important resource together. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge that on this very day, 46 years ago, the citizens of Santa Monica adopted the Rent Control Charter Amendment. Over the decades, rent control has played a vital role in promoting housing stability, preserving community diversity, and ensuring fairness in our rental housing market. And I'll spare you the song, but I'll say happy birthday, rent control. That concludes my comments.
Thank you very much. Okay, next up, item 10, jurisdictional items. We have 4 on the agenda. Oh, sorry, I skipped public comment. I don't have any speaker slips for any public commenters. Do we have anybody who would like to address the board? No, okay, we can move on, that's okay. Item 10, jurisdictional items, we have 4 exemptions on the agenda tonight. Commissioner Ivanov?
I'd move that we waive the staff reports and adopt the findings of fact and conclusion of law for all 4 exemptions simultaneously.
Do we have a second on that motion?
I'll second that.
Okay, motion from Vice Chair Ivanov and seconded, and do we have any questions or comment on that? Okay, can we have a roll call vote?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose?
Yes.
Commissioner Dudek?
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie?
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov?
Yes.
Chair Gonska?
Yes,
Motion carries.
thank you. Okay, item 10B, appeals. Now, the first appeal on the agenda tonight is a tenant not in occupancy case. May we have a staff report, please?
Good evening, Commissioners. Under the rent control law, if a landlord believes that the tenants of a unit are no longer using their control unit as their residence of usual return, which is a term defined under Regulation 3304, they can ask the board to increase the unit's MAR based on comparable market rents. Here, the landlord alleged that Megan Clark, who has lived in her unit since 1996, no longer uses it as her residence of usual return. In their petition, however, the landlord identified David Lash, who has lived with Ms. Clark since 1997, as a mere occupant and not a tenant. The Santa Monica Charter has a broad definition of who is a tenant, and the hearing officer found that Mr. Lash was also a tenant of the unit. The hearing officer found that while Ms. Clark was no longer used the unit as her residence of usual return since she moved to New Zealand to take care of her ill father and then stayed after his recovery, Mr. Lash continues to reside in the unit as his residence of usual return. The hearing officer therefore denied the petition, and the landlord, Mr. Megdal, has appealed. The board reviews this matter as an appellate body, and therefore, if substantial evidence supports the hearing officer's findings and the decision is reasonably supported by the record, the board should affirm the decision. In his written response to the staff report, Mr. Megdal argues that the hearing officer's finding that Mr. Lash is a tenant violates the state Costa-Hawkins law. But Mr. Megdal filed this petition under the board's regulation 3304, and courts have held that nothing in the language or legislative history of the Costa-Hawkins Act indicates an intent to supersede a local law's definition of a tenant. Substantial evidence supports the hearing officer's finding that Mr. Lash meets the rent control law's broad definition of a tenant, including evidence that in 2000, when the prior landlord evicted unauthorized occupants who had moved into Ms. Clark's apartment, he did not evict Mr. Lash. His daughter, who was also a property manager, testified that they considered Mr. Lash to be a tenant. They collected rent from him when Ms. Clark was out of the country. Because substantial evidence supports the hearing officer's finding and the decision is reasonably supported by the record, staff recommends that the board affirm the decision and its findings of fact and conclusions of law.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have any questions about the staff reports? Okay, we have a couple of speakers on this item, so I'll call you up individually to the podium here to address the board. The first person we have is Eric Alberta. Eric Alberts.
Andy, if I could defer, I'm the respondent on this, I represent the tenant, and so the appeal is on behalf of the appellant, so I was hoping just to respond if needed.
Okay, that's fine. We'll go first then to Mike Sloan. Yeah, you can step up to the podium here, and you'll have 5 minutes to address the board.
May I call in the owner, Mr. Megdal, via phone to speak on speakerphone?
I believe that's okay, if we're okay with it. Yeah, that's fine, as long as we can do it in a timely manner here.
Thank you.
Hey.
Hey, Taylor. Okay, it's our time. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I am ready to go.
Can y'all hear?
Can you just hold maybe the mic at the top of the bottom of your phone to the, or maybe the other way, wherever it's coming out of the phone, we can't really hear it too well.
1 second, Taylor.
Maybe give it a try now.
Okay, go ahead.
Perfect. Hello, commissioners. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you first and foremost for accommodating my use of FaceTime. I've been out of town, dealing with family stuff. So I unfortunately couldn't make it in person. But I guess if my 5 minutes, somebody can tell me when my 5 minutes starts, I'm ready to go.
Yeah, you can go ahead now.
Okay, perfect. So commissioners, I want you to understand, I mean, this case, which is being brought on appeal to you, forget the legal almost back and forth here. I just want everyone here to understand the layman kind of, fact pattern here, which was, this is the perfect anatomy of a scam, right? 10 years ago, my twin brother and I bought this. We're small landlords. We do commercial property development in Santa Monica, but we're very small residential owners, so it's not our expertise. And we bought this 10 years ago. We get an estoppel back from Megan Clark that indicates she's the only occupant and the only tenant in the unit. I interviewed all of the prospective tenants in the building before we bought it. She and I remember it 10 years ago because we had a very nice conversation that she was, a very esteemed St. John's head ER nurse. And she was looking forward to going back, to Australia and New Zealand to retire. So literally one of our underwriting principles was, oh my gosh, we're going to get this unit back. We have an estoppel from this lady who says she's the only occupant. She's the only tenant. This was 10 years ago when we bought it. Lo and behold, a couple years later, I see this fellow, John, coming, kind of going, being at the property. I check in with my attorney. I'm like, I don't know what to do about this. We have an estoppel that says it's just her. And now she says this gentleman and her are together and they're married or partners. And, first off, I've heard of it. My attorney says, great, well, there's nothing we can do about it because if she's married to the guy, he's allowed to be there, even if he's not on estoppel. Or if they're partners, he's allowed to be there. We're not allowed to, intrude in our tenants' personal lives, nor do y'all want us to. But literally, lo and behold, according to your staff report, that is me agreeing to this fellow being there. So fast forward 3 or 4 more years, I let them be because I'm not a controversial person. Let them be. And now I find out she had left to retire to New Zealand years ago, and he stayed behind.
Halfway done, Taylor.
Halfway done. So these people had been telling me they were married the whole time, yet 2.5, 3 years into it, she's in New Zealand, he's here. That's some functional marriage. I don't know what married people don't live together. I mean, and the hearing examiner established this. Literally, the hearing examiner in her wisdom saw through all of this nonsense. It was like, no, this woman, Megan Clark, has permanently, despite her lying to the opposite, doesn't live at this unit. She's permanently lived in New Zealand. We win that case. We win that fact. And second fact, they're not married. They're not in a domestic partnership. These people filed for a domestic partnership a day before the hearing. That's what fraudsters these people are. That's what a forethought this had. So then they drum up this 20-year-old landlord that they haul in to say, oh, I've seen John. He was here 20 years ago. But we didn't even know we were even litigating whether John or Jeff was even a tenant or not. We were just litigating whether she was living there or in New Zealand. She was contending she did. Whether they were married or not, they were contending they were. We were contending they weren't because they'd been living We're 5,000 miles away from one another for 3 years. How could they be married? So we win, but then some crazy way, the hearing examiner is like, well, he could be a tenant. We
45
weren't
seconds,
in
Taylor.
any position. Yeah, we weren't in any position to disprove that. So we're asking for a remand hearing to actually go back and see if this fellow was there continuously, if he paid rent to a landlord, if there's any way he could be considered a tenant, legally a tenant, and not just a roommate, and not just a fake boyfriend, fake lover. If he is a tenant and he wrote a check to a landlord and he can find it, he's entitled to be there. But short of that, this hearing examiner completely went off the deep end. And there's
Okay, the time is up, but thank you very much for your comments.
All right, Taylor, we're done. Thank you.
Does any commissioner have any questions for the speaker? No, okay. Thank you very much. We'll move to Eric Alberts, if you'd like to address the board. And you'll have 3 minutes when you're ready to begin.
Okay. All right, thank you and good evening. Yeah, just briefly, Megan Clark, who was the subject of the petition for the non-occupancy, she moved in this unit in 1996. Jeff Lash, her on and off boyfriend, roommate, whatever, moved in 1997. He was there continuously up until today. Taylor bought this apartment complex in about 2011, I believe. It was sometime in the I think it's after the aughts. And when he did, it was a probate sale because her father, the landlord, the original landlord, the father had died unexpectedly in a car accident. So he purchased this unit, and from the bank, he was given who resided in each one of these things. He failed to do his due diligence on this part because Jeff Lash had been in there the entire time. Jeff Lash had been considered a tenant to the prior landlord who tragically passed away. His daughter, who then took over the property as a property manager, also considered him a tenant. She wrote in a declaration, which is Exhibit 17, page 48, page 45 of Exhibit 17, and she actually put Jeff Lash on an increased rent notice in 2003. So this was all available. Mr. Megdal is now trying to turn back time. Mr. Lash was a tenant with the previous owners. And then Taylor himself also treated Jeff as a tenant as well because he asked him to do repairs in the unit. He's asked him to bring over things and to clean up things. And so he treats him as a tenant. He's owned the place for upwards of a decade and just last year decided to make a case out of Jeff being there after 10 years of him being there right the whole time. So, and they wrote checks on a joint account. It was no mystery. Jeff's always been there. And the prior daughter of the original landlord, she testified truthfully at the hearing, which went over 4 separate days during 2 years ago, and then it took nearly 10 months for the 40-page decision. This is well thought out, and yeah, we ask you to affirm the hearing officer's decision.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Alberts? No? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Ivanov.
I just had one question for staff. Can you just discuss what encompasses the definition of a tenant within regulations 1801 and 3304? There was a point made about them trying to register a domestic partnership the day before. Do they need to be domestic partner? Is that in any way relevant to this analysis? Can you just discuss the definition under those 2 regulations?
Sure. I mean, the definition of tenant is in our charter, and it's anyone who has a right to occupy a unit under an agreement. There's, the evidence brought out at the hearing is just what was described to you. It's what's in the record. So there's no requirement. Obviously, people can live together without being married or domestically partnered, and they're still entitled to occupy the unit as a tenant.
And the agreement does not need to be in writing if the conduct of the parties creates an inference that there's a landlord-tenant relationship, correct?
Correct.
Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner Leslie?
So we're clear that for 8 years of the new owner's ownership, that Mr. Lash was recognized as a tenant, even from the testimony of the former manager, daughter of the deceased. Is that clear? Is that correct? Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Ambrose?
Yeah, so I think that the staff did a really good job summarizing what's going on. And it seems that Mr. Lash has been occupying the unit for a very long time, well before the last owner, that both the last owner and this owner did know or should have known that Mr. Lash was a tenant or could be considered a tenant. His relationship, married domestic partnership to Megan Clark, to me seems not to be relevant to us or the issue. And I'd like to make a motion to go ahead and affirm this decision.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Ambrose and seconded by Vice Chair Ivanov. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Dudek,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, item 10C, removal permits. And we do have a few speakers here. This is for the property at 1320-1326 Pico Boulevard. May we have a staff report, please?
Certainly, Commissioners. 1320 Pico Boulevard is a 12-unit property, and its owners seek to demolish it and construct a 100-unit apartment building on the site. And to do so, they've applied for a removal permit from the board. Under the rent control law, the board may grant a removal permit if an owner is seeking to redevelop the site with new apartment buildings, so long as they deed restrict 15% of the control units on the property as affordable to low-income tenants. The board has consistently interpreted this provision to mean that there must be an equivalent number of control units in the new project as are being demolished, thereby preventing a loss of rent control units and replacing them with newly constructed rent control units. This project satisfies this requirement by controlling 12 of the new units as subject to the rent control law and deed restricting 15% of the 12 or 2 of the units as affordable to low-income tenants. Now, the city has its own inclusionary requirements, so in total, 16 of the 100 units are to be deed restricted as affordable units in the proposal as detailed in the staff report. Because the applicant seeks a removal permit instead of using the Ellis Act to demolish the existing units, they have also provided a tenant relocation plan consistent with those of other projects for which the board has granted a removal permit. The existing tenants are provided with several options. They may accept permanent relocation under the city statute, or they may temporarily move into a comparable unit for the duration of the construction and continue to pay the same MAR as under rent control, with the landlord paying any difference for the duration of the construction. And the landlord will cover the moving costs as well. Then when the project is built, the tenants can move back into a newly constructed comparable unit on the property and still pay the same MAR as under rent control. And if the tenants are low income, they can move into one of the deed restricted affordable units. If the board grants this removal permit, these conditions will be included in a removal permit agreement that is to be signed by the applicant with the board. And this is also the start of the process. There are other approvals that the applicant must receive from the city. The applicant estimates that construction won't start until June of 2027. Under state law, the owner must provide notice to the tenants a year before the start of construction that they will have to move out within 6 months. Because the proposed project satisfies the criteria for removal permit under the charter, staff recommends that the board approve the permit subject to the applicant's execution of a removal permit agreement as detailed in the staff report.
Thank you. Just before we move on to any questions from commissioners, I just want to disclose that the building owners and their representative reached out to me earlier this month to ask for a meeting about this agenda item. And I did meet with them, and they presented to me their proposal here that's before us tonight. So now we can take questions from commissioners, if there are any. Commissioner Ambrose.
So a question for staff about the different options that tenants have. So one option is you can relocate to a comparable unit and then move back. And then if you are low income, that would be a deed restricted affordable unit. When you move back. And if you are not considered low income, when you move back, would that unit still be rent controlled?
Yeah, you move back and you pay the rent control rent that you're paying now with annual increases under the rent control law.
So essentially for nothing would change?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Leslie?
So I have a question. If you have tenants that move out or take the temporary relocation and there's time to move back, and you have more low-income tenants at that time, what happens to those tenants?
The applicant has said there are, besides just the 2 that are going to be subject to rent control, there's 14 other deed-restricted units, and so those are also available to individuals who are moving back. There are only 10 occupied units on the property right now, so a portion of those are presumably low income, so they should be sufficient deed-restricted units for low-income tenants to be accommodated who are currently living on the property.
Thank you.
Commissioner Dudek?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. I just want to be clear. Okay, there's 14 affordable units, 2 deed restricted, and 10 under rent control right now. Is that correct?
There are currently 12 rent control units on the property
Yeah,
right now,
right.
right? What they're proposing is that there will be 12 rent control units on the property in the new project. 2 of the rent control units will be deed restricted as affordable to low-income people. 14 additional units will be deed restricted as affordable under the city's inclusionary requirements for a total of 16 deed restricted affordable units.
Right, so in response to the question that was just asked, if the rent control tenants move back and they are low income, and can they decide to take an affordable unit? If they do that, then I am assuming their rent-controlled unit, one of 10 or whatever, would then become market rate?
It would become market rate, but it would be still under the rent control law like every other.
Under rent control,
Right.
yes. I had a couple of other questions. I know that the owner has been, sounds like he's being generous in terms of the relocation, and the word proximity was mentioned, and I just wondered what proximity means in terms of the 1320 Pico Boulevard neighborhood.
Commissioner Dudek, you'll have an opportunity to ask the owner that question. He's going to get up and make
Oh,
some remarks.
okay, thank you. Well, then, I'll hold off with my couple other questions. Thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair Ivanov?
Is there an oversight or enforcement mechanism that periodically is going to make sure that the removal permit agreement is being complied with throughout the process?
So my understanding is that this agreement, as Mr. Mort, as I mentioned, this is the first step in the process, and that ultimately there'll be a development agreement with the city, which this will incorporate. And so in line with that, there'll be periodic updates and make sure that everyone's in compliance with both the development agreement and our agreement.
All right, we'll move to, do you have any additional comments? Or she's gonna wait until they address the board. So we'll move to the speakers on this agenda item. And first, Kevin Kozel, you can step up to the podium here. And when you're ready to begin, you'll have 5 minutes to address the board.
Before I start, can I reserve a minute for rebuttal?
Sure.
Turn on your mic.
Okay, good. Good evening, Kevin Kozel, 1250 6th Street, Santa Monica. I'm appearing on behalf of the property owner and the applicant. I agree with everything that staff has said. We very much appreciate staff's work on this and their recommendation, and we hope that you follow staff's recommendation and approve this. I do want to just again refocus and explain why we think this is such a beneficial approach, both for the board and for the tenants. It ensures that the 12 rent-controlled units will be replaced on site. In terms of the relocation benefits, that the tenants will be provided under this agreement, that they won't get this if the removal permit's not approved. So again, the tenants will be temporarily relocated out of the building at no additional cost. They'll continue to pay their MAR. Property owner will pay the difference of the rent for the replacement unit, will pay moving expenses. The tenants will then have the right to move back into a comparable unit in the new development at their old MAR. If they are low income, in addition, they will be able to move into a deed-restricted affordable unit. So this is we believe is a very good benefit for the tenants. The property owner wants to do right by the tenants and thinks this is the right approach. Now, if this is not approved, as staff said, the owner's only option at that point is to use the Ellis Act. And under the Ellis Act, the tenants will only get the relocation benefits under the city ordinance. They'll be required to leave. They will have no right to come back to the property, except under state law. If they're low income, they may have a right to come back. But if they're not low income, they will not have the right to come back. And even if they're low income, they won't have any temporary, they won't have temporary lodging or while the construction is ongoing. So this removal permit process truly provides existing tenants much greater benefits than they would otherwise be entitled to. And as staff has pointed out, the tenants also have the option, if they want, they can take the permanent buyout under the city's relocation plan. So overall, we think it is a very good approach, and we hope that you will approve this. And I'm available for questions.
Thank you. Do any commissioners have questions for Mr. Kozel? And Commissioner Dudek?
Yes, I was just wondering about the proximity issue for the placement. What do you consider proximity to 1320 Pico Boulevard? How far out would you go?
Well, we haven't figured that out yet, because what will normally happen, and I've worked on several relocation plans, there will be, the owners will work with the tenants and try to find them units that are satisfactory to the tenants. I mean, the idea is to keep them as close as possible to this property, and also, if to find units that the tenants find acceptable. And the additional point is that the tenants are really protected, because under the removal permit agreement, we have to coordinate with staff. And if a tenant doesn't like a unit or doesn't believe that it is comparable, they will tell that to staff, and we will work with staff and try to resolve this to find a comparable unit for them.
And I have one other question regarding the affordability units. What criteria are you using for the income requirement? And would it include moderate? Would it go that high?
Well, under the, quite frankly, this is very confusing, because there's new state law, government code section, and I believe this might be one of the very first projects going through that will use both a removal permit and the new state law. But under the city and state requirement, there's several levels of affordability. There's low, very low, low, and moderate. And so if a tenant qualifies for any of those categories under the income levels, they will be able to move into one of those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Leslie?
So my question is, if the need exceeds the number of units, you have 10 tenants right now. Let's say you have 2 that are deed restricted. If you have more than 2 that need that deed restriction, what then happens?
We will let them, our plan is, there are actually, as staff has indicated, there's a total of 16 deed-restricted units at the project. Of those 16, 2 will be designated as rent control. But if there are more than 2 existing tenants that are income qualified, we are working with the city to ensure that those tenants will be allowed to move back into a deed-restricted, a city deed-restricted unit, even though it's not a rent-controlled unit.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next speaker on this agenda item is Pierre Frazen. You can step up to the podium here, and when you're ready to begin, you'll have 5 minutes to address the board.
So I don't have a whole lot to share. Just, I guess some of the questions that I had were just answered. I have just concerns about how the units are going to be found, and is this all going to be discussed and written in the agreement before I sign it? I guess I also have questions about if the agreement is for all of us, or if it can be tailored for me because I'm not low income, or for someone else because they're older. So that's the type of question that I have.
Okay.
I don't know if asking questions to you guys, to you is the relevant medium, but
Yeah, so you can definitely speak with staff that's here tonight who will help you, whether it's tonight or at any point in this process. Our staff is more than willing to help you through this, any questions you have. Maybe Mr. Costello, if you have a chance to have a chat tonight, at least to exchange contact information, that'd be helpful. But for the purpose right now for you is just to give any information or concerns to the board. If you have anything else additional.
no, nothing additional.
Okay, thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
And then the next speaker on this agenda item is Mick Graham. You can step up to the podium here. And when you're ready to begin, you'll have 2 minutes to address the board.
Hey, my name is Mick Graham. Thanks for having me here today. I watch you guys on YouTube, so thanks for sharing it there. So just a couple of considerations. I wrote a letter already, attached that, but I want to nail in on a couple of things to the staff is that the offer I got, because I'm not exactly low income, work in IT, Red Bull here in Santa Monica, I was not offered rent control moving back. I was just offered market rate in the offer I got, so it didn't have that, so maybe that's something to look into. I think there's a lot of, the primary residents who live in this, my neighbors here, they are really old. And not a lot of them, they're very confused by what's going on. They don't have the judgment. Some of them are of age where it's really hard for them there. Some of them can't even hear, right? So it's like, so there's a lot of people here that really, not really even sure what's going on here. So I'm concerned about them. I had communication issues with them when I had a palm tree hanging over a power line for like 6 months. I just decided to live in and live with the risk. And there was no communication back and forward. So I encourage you to, if we go forward with this, keep them to keep track of them. So it's just your words, but also actions. Another thing that annoys me a little bit with this case is that they, for example, the Ellis Act. I'm not a lawyer, but I think Ellis Act is rent to own and not rent to rent. So it maybe I'm mistaken by that. So I think they are confusing with a lot of words in the communication to the tenants that scare them. I think a few days before this hearing went out, there was an email that went out that basically said this is the last day to sign, otherwise it's going to state law. I mean, if you don't know a lot, I'm not a lawyer, you get scared by that. So I think it's great that this city is growing. I'm worried that I have colleagues, especially younger people, that don't have a lot of money. I wish people can live and work here, attract talent, professionals. So I hope that we really stick with keeping the relativeness of the rent controls available in the city, because I think we can afford it. So I lived here since 2018. I'm an immigrant, citizen now, moved here, love this country.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Mr. Kozol, did you have any, you have 1 minute remaining if you'd like to address any of the comments that were made.
Yeah, I just want to reassure the board and the tenants that there may have been some, this is confusing, and there was some discussion about voluntary buyouts previously, but I want to assure the tenants that if this moves forward, every single existing tenant will be temporarily relocated. They will then have the right to move back into a new unit at their old MAR with the general adjustments. And if they are low income, they will be entitled to an affordable unit. And again, the extra protection is that this will be agreement between the property owner and the board. And we will not be able to do anything to move the tenants without the board confirming that we're in compliance with the agreement. So I just want to assure both the board and the existing tenants that the owner has every intention to work very carefully, make sure they are satisfied, and that this works out properly. So, thank you.
Commissioner Leslie, did you have a question for Mr. Kozol or just general? Okay, thank you very much. Do you? Okay. Okay, so we can move to a deliberation. Commissioner Leslie?
Is it possible that we could send staff out to the site to explain to the tenants exactly what's going on so they can have a little less fear is what's going to happen, going forward?
Yeah, I think that, I forgot to mention when Mr. Graham was up here speaking that we did receive the written comments that he submitted. And I think just when I was reading through it, I noticed that there were understandably some things in here that weren't accurate in terms of understanding what benefits and opportunities that the tenants will have. It's a very confusing process, even people who are experts in this subject matter. So it's totally understandable. But the good news is I think that some of the concerns that you in particular addressed, and it sounds like others have, actually aren't necessarily problems, and I think will be addressed to your satisfaction. So to Commissioner Leslie's point, there's definitely opportunity for that staff who's here tonight, and also staff that works in our office throughout business hours to communicate with you, to help you understand exactly what the process is. And also throughout the process to address any concerns, to raise any flags if the building owner is not living up to what they're supposed to be doing. But does any staff want to add anything to that, or?
No, I think that's right. And if we need to convene some sort of a tenant meeting and make sure that the communication is clear, we can certainly do that.
That's what I was referring to, like a tenant meeting, because some people probably work throughout the day or whatever activities they have during the regular work hours. If something could be arranged to come out like after 5 or 6.
Yeah, and we've seen that obviously recently with other properties in the city with construction-related relocations that can be very helpful to have specific opportunities for the group of tenants to come together to ask questions and to gain information rather than doing it individually. So yeah, I would encourage that as well. Commissioner Ambrose? Oh, you're good? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay. One thing that I'll just add too is I think, as I just alluded to, I was referring to 227 Senti, which is a different issue we've had on the agenda in previous months and follow-up reports since then. And I think one thing we saw with that property that has been very encouraging to me is that the building owners had a very specific plan to not only comply with the law, but also to address the tenants' concerns and to communicate with them on a regular, ongoing basis. And it seems, all indications are so far in that property, that the building owner, the management company have lived up to their requirements so far and gone above and beyond. And that makes the process so much easier for everyone involved, because there's obviously the baseline of what the law requires and what our regulations require. But sometimes you can do just the bare minimum and it still turns into a very contentious, unfortunate relationship between the parties involved. And there's a way to avoid that. And I think that everything that I've heard in the meeting that I disclosed that I had prior to this meeting and everything we've heard tonight, in my opinion, it seems like the building owner is very willing and dedicated to doing this in a way that keeps everyone not only getting what they're due by the law and the regulations, but happy and up to date on all the information involved. So I would just encourage that to continue to, in that way going forward. And I think also, obviously, the devil's in the details, or the detail. So it's like, the more that this process goes on and it's not in front of the board, the five of us commissioners here are not going to necessarily be aware of any things that are not happening according to how they're supposed to be. So it is up to the tenants, it is up to the staff to make sure that we're monitoring that, and the tenants are flagging to us anything that's not happening appropriately. But like I said, I'm very encouraged by the plan that's before us today, which is all we can react to in terms of it being thorough and meeting the requirements of the law, and also, I think, the expectations, hopefully, of the tenants. So with that, is there anyone who would like to make a motion on this agenda item? Commissioner Leslie?
I move that we approve these plans and we approve the removal permit application.
Second.
We have a motion from Commissioner Leslie and seconded by Vice Chair Ivanov. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Yes. Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Dudek,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, moving on to item 12, administrative items. 12A is the 2024 annual report. And can we now receive the report from staff, please?
All right, good evening, Commissioners. It is my pleasure to present this report on behalf of the agency. As Mr. Howell said earlier, a lot of work goes into this. Everybody in the agency contributes to it, and it's a big lift. In here, I haven't done this presentation in a few years because I've had staff do this, so it's kind of nice to return to doing it. And I always like to make a point of saying that, you know, there are a lot of statistics and quantitative analysis in this report, but I'd like you just to keep in mind the amount of work that actually goes into each one of those numbers. So any one contact with the public could be, you know, a 40-minute traumatic phone call and research afterward, you know, any hearing or any petition that's filed, you know, involves back and forth with the petitioners before the petition's filed, and you know, tracking it through noticing of mediations and multiple hearings possibly, and appeals and requests for compliance. So there's a lot to each number that you see. So as I go through this, there are a lot of numbers, and I sort of apologize for that, but keep that in mind. And if you have any questions as I'm going through, please feel free to stop me. So I'll begin with the new developments, and of course, the year started off with a bang with the successful replacement of our longtime executive director Tracy Condon with John Holub. Mr. Holub has seamlessly managed the transition and continues to build on the foundation he inherited, and now with a full year under his belt. And in his leadership, we are still pursuing the mission with as much energy as ever. So that's great. Our mission has been assisted with some developments by the city council and by the state that enhance tenant protections. Locally, the city modified some regulations to enhance permanent relocation. So now if a tenant has been temporarily relocated for 6 months, they can request permanent relocation from the landlord. The city now requires that buyout offers for all units, not just rent control units, be registered with the city clerk, and that all of the buyouts have to be at least for the minimum permanent relocation fee that a tenant would receive. Our annual report has a lot of details about buyout agreements and what the averages were last year, depending on unit size and city area. So people can go there for more information. The city also defined harassment to include making buyout offers within 6 months of a tenant's written refusal that they're not interested in getting a buyout offer. And they also included in harassment withholding the right to sublease when a tenant otherwise has that right. And then on the state level, which we'll hear more about that, I'm sure, about things that are coming, but the state made it easier for tenants when they're moving into units by limiting screening fees in some cases and capping the security deposit that can be collected to no more than 1 month's rent in most cases. And then also giving tenants who are faced with an eviction more time to respond to the UD. And then among very local changes for the board, led by Chair Gonska last year and Commissioner Gwynn, the board decided to adjust the upper and lower ranges for the decrease amounts that hearing officers use when owners have taken away amenities or not maintaining a property. And these have not been adjusted since 2016. So the new regulations take into account the way that rents have changed over that time. And they will continue to be automatically adjusted every 2 years. So that's a big development. And they also streamlined the hearings procedures, so that was good. And then, unfortunately, what didn't happen was the passage of the Justice for Renters Act, and which would have returned authority to the local jurisdiction and repeal the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act. And the effects of that are what we're going to be looking at a lot tonight, how much that has impacted us locally. So at the end of 2024, there were 27,668 units subject to rent control. That was an actual increase of 65 units. The number doesn't change a whole lot from year to year, but it does depending on exemptions that are granted or units that may be come back after being withdrawn under the Ellis Act. You can see from the pie chart, now after 26 years of Costa-Hawkins, 3 out of 4 units are now at market rate. And many of these have been rented multiple times at higher and higher market rates. We also show a small increase this year of units that have Section 8 vouchers. We had seen that declining, but there was a small increase this year. So that's also positive. But the bar chart on the lower right shows that over time, we've been losing the long-term units to market rate units. And last year, the 185 units that formerly were long-term controlled are now at market rate. The rate at which these units are converting from long-term to market rate is declining actually each year, and just 2.7% of the available units of the market rate units, I mean the long-term units, went to market rate. So tenants are staying in their units, it seems. So this percentage has been shrinking over time. So we look at the controlled units by the city area and the unit size. When we look at the MARs for, the median MARs for units of different sizes, you have to keep in mind that there are a lot more one-bedroom units and two-bedroom units than there are three-bedroom units or studios. So there's more of an impact on what happens with the one-bedroom and two-unit units. So right now, about half of the units are one-bedroom, and then the next is the two bedrooms. And together, these two represent 82% of the controlled housing stock. We also look at the units by city area. There are a lot more details in the annual report itself on how the medians are by city area and by bedroom size. We're going to generally look at the citywide medians tonight. But just a kind of a comparison, so like city area D, which is that Pico corridor, has about half as many units as area G. So that's in the northeast corner of the city. So as has been the case, when we look at the median MARs that are established by year, we continue to see them go up across pretty much all unit sizes. So a one-bedroom unit rented at the median last year was $2,650. And for those who aren't clear, median means that half of the units were rented for more and half of the units were rented for less. So this chart, the bar chart, actually represents 98,776 tenancies that have been registered since 1999. So all of those units, whether they were rented once or twice, are counted here, and that's how we get the medians that are shown. Last year, there were 2,427 units that were rented at market rate, and that was up slightly from the 2,355 that we saw in 2023, but pretty consistent. We're generally around 2,400 units that are getting re-rented every year, which is a little bit less than 10% of the total. We may still get registrations for tenancies from 2024 that are filed late, so these numbers will change a little bit from year to year. So again, we saw new highs set for 2 and 3 bedroom units. But as you can see in the table on the lower left, this is figure 9 in the report, we do see that after the big increases following COVID, so in 2022, we saw rents going up, at double-digit percentages, between 10 and 20%. But since then, things have really leveled off. If you look at the studios, the 0-bedroom units, they've been hovering around $2,100 for the last 3 years. There really hasn't been much change in what you can get for a studio. That's still more than $25,000 a year, but it doesn't seem like those just don't seem like they're going up as much. So maybe we've plateaued, but I think that from year to year it never kind of happens. One-bedroom units have really not increased very much. I'm sorry that a little bit of that chart is missing, but there was a 0% increase in 2024 for the one-bedroom units. And so if you kind of look at over 2 years, they've really only gone up about 2%. Again, this really depends on how many of the two-bedroom units are rented in a year, but it looks like the market is slowing down a little bit. On the right, there's the pie chart, and this shows tenancies by the year that they started. So the 21.5% in the upper right are the pre-99 tenants. And then after that, we show 5-year increments until we get to the 9%, which was the 2024 tenancies. So this is also meant to kind of give perspective to the rent chart on the left, because you see that most of the tenants who moved into market rate units are paying the rents that are on the right side of that bar chart, or the darker columns. So even though, you know, we have some rents that are lower, that started back in, you know, the 2000s, most of the tenants are paying those higher rents that you're seeing on the right. I also think this pie chart is interesting because it shows kind of how fresh the population is in Santa Monica. I mean, we have that group of tenants, the 21% or 1 out of 5 units that are, the people have been living there for at least 25 years. But then you see a lot of units that have been rented very recently, almost half within the last 6 years. So that tells us we need to communicate with these people and make sure that they know their rights under the rent control law, because they just haven't been around as long. But we have some figures about that, and I'll present them in a minute. So with the rents rising to what they are, we look at what is, you know, what are affordable levels. First, figure 12 compares the difference between the market rate units and the long-term units. And so these are the median of all of those units. And you can see that the median for units rented in 2024 on the right there, 2950, is really about 2.5 times higher than the median for a long-term unit. So if someone were to paying the median price, if they were to relocate, they'd be looking at rent that was 2.5 times higher than what they're paying. Then figure 19 shows the income needed today that would be needed to afford a median priced 1, 2, or 3 bedroom unit if they were rented at the medians shown on the bar chart. So the third column there just kind of repeats the medians from last year that you saw on the bar chart. And then we use HUD figures to figure out what would the income, what income would be needed to make that unit affordable. And so for a studio, you would need at least $84,000 to afford it. In the report, we use the example of a couple working in Santa Monica at the minimum wage that the city requires, and they would need to spend 35% of their income to share a studio, or if they wanted to get a 1-bedroom unit, they'd have to spend 44% of their income for that sized unit. And then consider that most of the units, again, are the 1- and 2-bedroom units. Most of the new renters would need a household income of $106,000 to $144,000 to afford a unit in Santa Monica today. And that's well above the area median income for the LA area, which is $98,400. Prior to vacancy decontrol, about 84% of the units in Santa Monica were affordable to low-income households. And 6% of the units required household income at 110% of AMI or more. Today, that number is 95%. So, but there is value to tenants who remain in their rent-controlled units. So figure 16 shows the difference, this is for a 1-bedroom unit, the difference between the median set in 2024 of $2,650. And the chart looks at, for those tenancies that began in those different years since 1999, and we add all of the general adjustments to the median rent that was set for those tenancies, and we compare it to $2,650. And you can see for the tenants who have stayed in their units for a long time, they're seeing very big savings compared to today's rents. Interestingly, though, If you look on the right, you see some where, so for tenancies that began in like the last 6 years, in some cases, the rent that the tenant is paying today, and this is all based on medians, the median rent with general adjustments is actually higher than the rent for a unit, a new unit at the median set in 2024. And that could be because those units, I mean, those rents were high, to begin with, and since then, we've had some sizable general adjustments. And most of these rents are going to get the cap on the GA rather than the percentage increase. So we've had recent caps of $70, $76, $67. And so with those added to their base rent, they're actually paying more than what they would pay if they were to move into a new unit today, or another unit at medians. So then on to a different section of the report. This is the impact of the Ellis Act. And for anyone who doesn't know, the Ellis Act allows somebody to go out of the rental housing business, and then really they evict all the tenants, and then generally have to find a different use for the property. They're not going to be in the rental housing business anymore. Since the Ellis Act began in 1986, we've had 696 properties that were withdrawn. And just kind of going down the property list there, we do see that some have been returned to the rental market. And that's about a third of the units that, or of the properties that were withdrawn at one time. And then we also have 15 properties where the property was Ellis'd, and then new units were built and offered for rent within 5 years, and those are subject to the rent control law. So we consider those kind of coming back. So we have a net loss of 487 properties, and we're looking at units, 2,046 units that have been lost. Again, that's about a third that have come back, though. This was interestingly another year where the net units from net Ellis activity, the units, we had more units coming back into controlled housing than going out. So this has only happened in 7 of the 39 years since we've had the Ellis Act. But you can see from the trend chart at the bottom, that Ellis activity has been relatively low in recent years. Before the pandemic, we were seeing 92, 97, 90 units being withdrawn annually, and lately we've been around 20. There was a, one of the questions is, how are units coming back when they're supposed to be going out of the rental housing business? And 2024 brought us the decision in the Barrington Plaza case, and that ruling, basically said that owners have to, in good faith, go out of the rental housing business. They can't go out and then, with the intention that they're going to renovate the units, come back in and charge higher rent. So the ruling is that tenants can sue for a wrongful eviction in that case, and it's not the correct use of the Ellis Act. So maybe that will reduce some Ellis activity if we can have enforcement. All right. We also look at Ellis Act withdrawals by city area. As you can tell from the map, they've been pretty well distributed across different city areas. There hasn't been much change here in 2024. Just the overall share, I don't know if the table makes immediate sense, but On the left, we show by city area the total number of units that have been withdrawn and what percentage of Ellis units those were. And by that, you would say that city area E has had the greatest impact from Ellis activity. But then we look at, you know, the number of units that have been returned. And then we also look at what's the percentage or what share of the total units are in that area. And when we do that, we can see that the lowest share of units that have been withdrawn has been in areas B and D, which just had 4.6 or 4.1% of their units withdrawn, respectively. So we also look at the permits that are issued on withdrawn properties, and so we can tell how they are being used after they've been withdrawn. In most cases, it's kind of represented by almost the entire right side of the pie chart. The post-Ellis use is for some sort of residential use, so for apartments, condos, mixed use, single-family dwellings, and then various other uses on the left-hand side. We do have some units where we don't have any residential permit activity, but we're continuing to monitor those and see what's happening with those properties. This really hasn't changed too much, and especially since that we had relatively low Ellis activity last year. It's not really changed. All right, now on to the great Public Information Department. So that's my department. We do a lot of work with tenants and landlords. We're sort of the first line of contact for most people with our public counter. We had 11,608 contacts last year. That was actually down a little bit from the year before, which was 2023, and I think we had about 13,000 contacts that year. But I think the reason is that 2023, we're still dealing with the adjusted general adjustment and the confusion over that. And so we had a lot of people calling us just trying to figure out what were the allowable rents. So we also do a lot of the tenancy registration. This has been shifting a little bit more to the staff assistants in the administration department. So I have to give them credit. They do a lot of the tenancy registrations. And as I said, we had like 2,400 tenancy registrations that they processed over the year. The Public Information Department gets involved when it's more complex and we need to talk with the property manager or owner and find out what's going on. I won't bother to read the rest of it, but we also, we put the content on the website. The number of page views has declined also. We think that's a combination of, again, not having the AGA confusion, people getting more familiar with the website and where to find information, and then owners being able to do more with their civics accounts and file tenancies and get property information directly from their civics account. And we're now up to 1,900 civics accounts. So it's mostly property managers and owners filing registration forms. So again, this year, we did look at where our tenant contacts were coming from. Again, if you look at the map, it's generally spread out. We get contacts from around the city. So this was really, staff would take the address of tenants, and it wasn't in all cases, but we think we got a representative sample. It's over 600 units, so that's what's mapped here. But we wanted just to see, if different areas of the city were contacting us more or less than other areas. But as we found last year, there's really a very small difference between the percentage of units in an area and the percentage of contacts from that area. It varies just by 4 points, which is pretty much what we saw last year. There are a couple of areas that give us a little bit more work, like area F, and then area A. F is north of downtown, and then we have area A in Ocean Park, which doesn't contact us as much. Then we also looked at tenant contacts by the MAR that they are paying and how long they've been in their units. And so the first graph there, figure 34, shows that the mean MAR of all the tenants who contacted us was 2,314. And that is very close to what the median MAR is for all controlled units. So we think that's a pretty good distribution. So the area underneath the curve represents tenants who, the volume of tenants who are contacting us at those different rent levels. And similarly with the long-term tenants and the market rate tenants that are shown on the right, most of the contacts are pretty close to what the mean MAR is for those types of units. We also looked at the percentage of tenants contacts versus the percentage of tenants from those years. So the columns on 36 really represent that same pie chart that I showed earlier, where we have about half the units being relatively new tenants. And when you compare the percentage of tenant contacts versus the percentage of all tenancies, you see, like on the left for the 1999 or long-term tenants, that they are more likely to contact us. So they're a smaller percentage of the tenancies, but a greater percentage of the contacts. And then on the right, you see that the newer tenants are a larger percentage of the the newer tenants are the larger percentage, but they don't contact us as much. That trend kind of continues until you get down to that 2004 to 2008 range. So it's the longer term tenants who are contacting us disproportionately more, but not a lot more. It's pretty proportional. All right, and now into the Great Hearings Department. So the Hearings Department adjudicates all the administrative proceedings and takes in all of the petitions and complaints from both landlords and tenants. And if you look at the trend lines on the right for the most common petitions, the decrease petition, the construction-related decrease petition, and excess rent petitions, you can see how those are trending. The decrease petitions are going up, both types, and there were 95 decrease petitions filed last year, and 27 construction-related decrease petitions. The yellow line underneath shows those that are filed by market rate tenants, and remember they're about 75% of all of the controlled units. And so it's pretty proportional here. For the decrease petitions, the market rate tenants represent 74% of the petitions that were filed. And this kind of goes against some claims that it's only the long-term tenants who file petitions and all the new tenants are happy. And 81% of the construction-related decrease petitions were filed by market rate tenants. On the left, we see the continued success of the mediation program. 64% of the decrease petitions were fully or partially resolved in mediation. 45% of the construction-related decrease petitions were resolved, and that's just great. So that gets the resolution that we hopefully would get to after going through the whole petition process, but a lot faster. And then excess rent petitions also have a high success rate for mediation. 58% have been resolved. As you may recall, we made an administrative change in the way that excess rent petitions are filed. Tenants now have to notify their landlord first and make a claim for what they believe is excess rent. And hopefully, those are getting resolved directly between the tenant and the landlord before they ever come to us. And that may explain why we see a decrease in the number of excess rent petitions. And we saw that last year. There are many more details on the outcomes of the petitions in the hearings departmental overview. So if you really want to get into the weeds, that's where it is. And although we haven't featured our legal department in recent years, I thought it was appropriate. I think the board is very familiar with what the legal department does. Obviously, there's the board advisory work, which, people can see at public meetings like this, but then there's also other stuff that is out of the public view and is protected by attorney-client privilege. The report overviews several cases in which the legal department defended the board's decision, including a judgment for the board in 2024, where a landlord challenged the board's decision on an appeal of a tenant not in occupancy petition like we heard tonight. Then the regular feature of these meetings are the staff reports on appeal and all of the jurisdictional items. And they provide the succinct summaries and recommendations for the board, and statistics on all of these. The numbers and the types are also available in the annual report in the index section, the appendix section. And then there are a lot of other things that the legal department does, including exemption monitoring and lapsing. I believe we lapsed 15 exemptions last year just based on the monitoring. We advise on removal permit applications, like the one that was before the board tonight again. Responding to administrative records requests and other records requests. We get a lot of records requests. Drafting resolutions and amendments to regulations, like those for decrease amounts and the hearing process. Preparing amicus briefs and ensuring property owners comply with the requirement to pay registration fees. And last year, the department was very successful in collecting outstanding fees in the amount of $78,000 without going to court, but they also filed 20 limited civil cases and 20 small claims cases. So that funds the essential work of the board. I'll also say that they play a vital role in helping staff, because we often have questions about interpretations of regulations, and the legal department is always available to us and very helpful for giving us clarity. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have. This report will be on the website tomorrow for anyone who would like to download it. We can provide copies in the office as well. And if anybody has any questions for staff in general, there is our contact information. All right.
Yeah, thank you very much. Every year, this is, it's such a wealth of information here, and something that I know throughout the year as I have each year, I'm sure I'll reference this report many times. As we're going through, whether they're decreased petitions or any other agenda items that come up, there's often things that trigger questions that we have, and obviously we go to staff a lot to ask those questions, but I find myself often going to this annual report to look up and often find the answers. So thank you to you and to the whole staff for putting so much work into this and such detailed information. So I have a couple of questions, but actually, Vice Chair Ivanov, you're in the queue, so why don't you go first?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I echo Chair Gonska's comments. Thank you so much for putting this together. This is really great work and comprehensive. The one question that I just had, one of Commissioner Leslie's big priorities, I apologize if I'm stealing your thunder, by the way, has been bringing more inclusivity in terms of the way the agency communicates, with the community. And that being specifically with trying to get, more languages, with the newsletter, and maybe contacts with tenants. I noticed in the chart that you had with the tenant contacts by region, I saw a couple green dots, with Spanish in there. Has there been any, push or effort to try to include more languages in that? Or has there just been a situation where there hasn't been a need to go outside of English and Spanish at this point?
To be honest, we really haven't seen the need. We do have, as I presented a few months ago, resources that we can use if somebody wants service in another language. We have a language helpline. There are automatic translation available on the website and on our seminars. So we just haven't had the demand. As I said, this was a representative sample of contacts, and so it could be that, well, I know it's the case, that we help many more people than the green dots that you saw there in Spanish. It happens almost every day. And we have two bilingual information coordinators. So we're available. It's just it's a challenge. I mean, we did have a tenant seminar in Spanish last year, and we will always continue to do that. We do make the newsletter available in Farsi, Amharic, and Spanish. We'll make the summer one available in those languages as well. I'm intending we have a rent control information sheet that has to be given to every tenant when they move in. It notes on there that they can get that in a different language if they would like from our website. I intend this year to add Russian to that. So it's an effort we have to continue to make, I agree.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Leslie.
So if we do have someone that comes to the rent control and they need to communicate in either of those languages, whether it be Russian or Amharic, is there anyone available, or how would they communicate?
So there are two options. One, there is a list of available resources of people who work at the city who are certified, or they've been tested to be able to get pay in those languages. So those people are available depending on the language, but they may not actually be available at the moment that the person comes in. But we do have a language access line that we can call, and the service will do simultaneous interpretation.
Thank you.
I said when I presented, we had one person who requested service in Bulgarian, but eventually he said he was good with English. But I was hoping to use the language line.
Thank you.
A couple of questions that I have from your presentation. One was when it comes to Ellis Properties and the geographical distribution. Obviously, this report details, over the past year what we've seen, or even over like a 3-year period, certain statistics. But are there any specific areas of the city that you notice any trends over a longer period of time, or any particular part of the city, any of those zones that tend to have the most?
Right. Well, clearly from the chart there on the right, like we've lost 32% of the units in the downtown area to Ellis activity. A lot of those were single room occupancy units that were withdrawn very early when Ellis came in. I don't think there's been a lot of activity lately there. But yeah, we haven't noticed anything that's very, very strong in one neighborhood versus another. We range from outside of the downtown area. it's between 4 and, well, 3, and, yeah, about 4 and 9% of the units in any area. But with very low Ellis activity, in recent years, we're not seeing any kind of trend.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it was encouraging first to see that we had well, I guess it wasn't directly, well, I guess it was Alice, the statistics of how many, there's a net gain of rent-controlled units in the city. I think that was entirely, or at least mostly due to previously Alice units coming back,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, and there was the fifth straight year, as the report notes, of controlled units increasing. So that's always a concern of mine. It seems like the trend line would be the other way. So it's, even though it's a small number, it's in the right direction.
Yeah, obviously the market is strong. I mean, you can command very high rents for controlled units, so I think there's a reason to stay in the rental housing business. In fact, what we're seeing are people building more, ADUs. So hopefully that will continue.
That's actually a good segue to my other question. What you had mentioned at one point in your remarks tonight about essentially the GAs being large enough that for a lot of tenants, their rents are actually higher than they could get as a new tenant in a median unit with the same bedroom size.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that or talk more about that? I found that really fascinating because it's similar to a similar point to what I've seen in certain cases where people who are, relatively new tenants, although not brand new, are often paying even higher than market rate, just factoring in the GAs over 3 or 4 or 5 years.
That's right. We only really saw that with the one-bedroom units, but again, they're a large share of the controlled housing stock. There were, on the other size units, there were a couple of blips where, recent tenants are paying more than what the recent median MAR was. Yeah, I don't have anything more to say other than I think it's just since rents have been increasing at lower percentages, as I said, 2% over the last couple of years for one-bedroom units, whereas we had 3% GA. And again, those people are generally, the newer tenants are paying the higher rents and are seeing the caps, which are, it's less than 3%, but it's still sizable. So.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Ambrose?
And thanks for the report. Just one thing that stuck out to me was about the different types of bedroom sizes, that there seems to be a real lack of 3 bedrooms. I think the report actually said the 0 bedrooms are the studios, although they were a large percentage that maybe they were still in demand or that there was not enough stock. Maybe that's how I read it, that there was a need for more studio and 3 bedrooms.
Yeah, so the studios are 11% of the controlled housing stock, and the 3 bedrooms are 7%. I think it is what it is. I mean, that's that's what the housing stock looked like in 1979 when rent control came along, and I don't think there's been many changes to that. So it makes it hard because, as I said, most of the units, 82% of the units are the larger units, and they have higher median MARs. Obviously, they can house more people, so you can have 2, people renting a 1-bedroom. Anecdotally, just living here in the city, I know that around me, the 1-bedroom units that used to be occupied by 1 person are now occupied by 2.
Right. And the same with the 3 bedrooms, I'm sure.
Yeah, probably.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Okay, thank you very much for the report. I know we need to make a motion here to receive the report, but
That's right. I don't know you have to necessarily make a motion, but the charter does require that you report to the city council annually on the status of controlled rental housing. So in past years, I think you just, by consensus, just given us direction, and then we'll get it to the city council.
Okay, yeah.
I took a motion last year, Dan, so.
Okay,
I'm trying
I'm
to.
sorry.
Yeah, it makes me feel better.
Well,
By all means, Mr. Executive
All right, let's do
Director.
it. Would anyone like to make a motion to receive the 2024 annual report and direct the executive director to transmit the report to the city council per charter section 1803?
I'll see if I can remember that.
No, you could just say, you most.
Yes, I make a motion that we accept the report.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay. Motion by Commissioner Dudek and a second by Commissioner Ambrose. Can we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Commissioner Ambrose,
Yes.
Commissioner Dudek,
Yes.
Commissioner Leslie,
Yes.
Vice Chair Ivanov,
Yes.
Chair Gonska.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Great, thank you. All right, next item on the agenda is item 12B. We have Brian Augusta here, our legislative advocate, for our 2024-2025 legislative session reports. So I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair and members. Brian Augusta, your legislative advocate up in Sacramento. Pleasure to be here tonight to provide a little overview of this year's legislative session and some bills of interest to the board that are moving through the process. Let me just set the stage a little bit. Right now, here in early April, we're at the very beginning of the busy part of the legislative session. Policy committees have begun. Budget committees are meeting as well. Next week, the legislature takes a week off for spring break, but when they return, there's a huge agenda of bills to be culled through over the next 3 weeks. For all of those bills to clear the policy committee, head, if they do, to the appropriations committee and then the floor, leading up to the end of May. So the next few weeks in Sacramento are going to be very busy. And despite leadership in both houses setting some new limits on how many bills each member can introduce, so they lowered the number of bills, that really didn't have a meaningful change, it seems to us, on the number of housing and tenant-related bills that got introduced. And we're tracking close to 300 bills. Not all of those will move, but a pretty significant number of pieces of legislation dealing with the housing crisis and tenant protections and rent stability in California. And that does continue to be a major theme. I think there are sort of 4 themes of this year's session that I want to emphasize in terms of where the legislature is focusing with respect to issues of interest to this board. The first, of course, is tenants' rights, and we have a lot of, as our report indicates, a number of bills dealing with various issues related to stronger tenant protections. Rent stabilization as well, although we don't have any bills, strictly related to local implementation of rent stabilization policies or policies like Costa-Hawkins or Ellis. Those are not on the agenda, but we do have some other bills related to rent stabilization. The tragic fires in this area have led to a lot of legislation dealing both with response to Los Angeles area recovery efforts, but also, interestingly, for the first time, have spurred some bills looking to sort of future-proof our response to disaster with respect to housing by finally taking a cut at trying to address what are the likely impacts following a disaster like fire or earthquake, and how do we, instead of reacting in each individual case, put some protections in place that will be somewhat more self-executing and uniform. So with those 4 themes, and then housing affordability, sorry, I meant to mention that. The biggest issue, there are a number of approaches to the question of housing affordability, but one of the biggest issues that we face is that for housing that's truly affordable to low-income households, That requires a partnership with state and other governmental entities to provide the subsidies to make sure that we get affordable deed-restricted housing. And the state's coffers that help produce those affordable units are beginning to run dry. It's been a number of years since the voters have approved a voter initiative to establish bond financing to fund those programs. And there are bills moving through the legislature this year to put a bond on the 2026 ballot. Both of those two bills would establish a $10 billion bond to fund various programs. But going back to the top of my list, sort of on the key themes, in rent stabilization, as you all know, the Tenant Protection Act provides protections to renters who are not covered by a local rent stabilization ordinance by establishing a cap on rents that is equivalent to the cost of living adjustment, or the CPI, plus 5% or a maximum of 10%, plus providing just cause protections to those two covered tenants. That cap has proven to be, since it was enacted in 2019, as everyone knew, fairly generous. And as we have been in an inflationary period, we have seen rents rising for many households year upon year at that close to 10% level. So, and in addition, the TPA, the Tenant Protection Act, originally, and still does, excludes most single-family homes. So AB 1157 does two things with respect to those two issues. Number one, it lowers the rent cap. The current proposal in the bill is CPI plus 2% or a maximum of 5%. So cutting the overall maximum rate in half, and then eliminating the exception for single-family homes, making all renters protected regardless of whether they live in an apartment, a condo, or a single-family home. And also removes the sunset. The law would sunset in 2030, so getting a head start on making the law permanent. Also sort of in the rent stabilization, but disaster-related realm as well, are two bills. AB 380, as you may be aware, as I'm sure you're aware, state law, in addition to other protections, provides in the penal code a criminal prohibition on rent gouging in the aftermath of a disaster, such as the one Los Angeles area fires, that among other protections, prohibits rent gouging or price increases above 10%. That includes rental housing, and the provisions of the law are a little unclear, but there is a provision which arguably says that the 10% limit on rent increases following a disaster applies during the entire pendency of the emergency declaration, whereas other protections in the law arguably expire 30 or 180 days after the declaration of emergency, so as little as 30 days after that declaration, those protections expire. AB 380 would make it clear that the price gouging protections are throughout the state of emergency. They apply it to commercial tenancies and remove some of the, I shouldn't have used that to gesture, excuse me, remove some of the exclusions in the rental housing field, including that currently the law limits the protections only to leases of 12 months or fewer. So if you have a longer term lease, it doesn't cover the rent gouging. That distinction is being removed. In addition, Assemblymember Bryan has a very Los Angeles specific rent stabilization disaster related provision, which if enacted would cap all rent increases for anyone who was an existing tenant on the day the declaration was made following the fires, that their rent cannot be increased more than 3% until this law sunsets, which is March 1st of next year, so a little bit over a year. It's not in place now, but if it were enacted, that would be the law. Also in the disaster realm, in response to some of what we've seen here, SB 610 by Senator Perez does a number of things that, as I was talking about earlier, sort of establish this self-executing set of protections that fall into place following a disaster that benefit renters. For example, tolling many of the timelines in an unlawful detainer or eviction action. One of the problems we see always following these disasters, or as was also true with COVID, people don't have access to mail, harder to get to the courthouse, maybe are unable to, are not even in the area because they have been evacuated. So by tolling things like the summons in an unlawful detainer, the trial setting, the sheriff's notice, all of those things provide greater protections. It also would establish that during any time period that the tenant is not in occupancy because they have been subject to an evacuation order, they are not, the rent is not due for that time period. If the unit is destroyed and they've prepaid the rent, they're entitled to a refund of the rent, which is not currently, clearly in the law. And then if the unit is partially destroyed or has damage, clarifying the landlord's obligations to clean up the unit as well as repair it, and then establishing a right for the displaced household to return at the rent that they were at the time of the disaster. So that's SB 610. Switching to another sort of area of concern in the landlord-tenant realm. Increasingly, we are seeing landlords using fees, what are sometimes referred to as junk fees, to increase the cost of rental housing to the tenants outside of rent. So we'll see an advertised rent, but when the tenant goes to lease up the unit, they learn for the first time that there are all these mandatory fees that are attached to it that are not in that rent figure. We're also seeing landlords take rent with sitting tenants that includes a suite of services, right? Housing services that are always included in the rent, and then unbundling those. And so charging separately for things that used to be included in the rent, which is a practice that is emerging in part in response to the Tenant Protection Act, because if they can unbundle those services, charge them separately as fees, although we think the law is pretty clear that that violates the Tenant Protection Act. It's not expressed. And so you can unbundle those fees, increase the rent total cost of the tenant by charging more for those fees, and increase the rent under the TPA, thereby bypassing the goal of the TPA of capping rents at 10%. So there are a couple of bills that are looking at these practices. The most robust one is AB 1248 by Assemblymember Haney. It is co-sponsored by the Attorney General, Consumer Federation of California, and the California Rural Legal Assistance Foundation and National Housing Law Project. And it essentially provides that for new tenants, there is just one charge, and it's called rent, and everything that you provide is in that rent, with some enumerated exceptions that can be charged separately. The idea being that once you do that and you've agreed to all those services, then that rent is the amount. Not only is that more transparent to the tenant, but it makes it clear what is subject to the rent cap. It would also effectively ban ratio utility billing services systems going forward, and establishes that if there's a decrease in services, then that is an increase in the rent. Now, it doesn't have an administrative system for resolving those questions, but it does provide that is the function of reducing housing services. Senator Wahab has SB 381, which also tackles fees, but does it a little bit differently because it provides that these fees can be charged, but as long as they are disclosed in the rental agreement. So a little bit different approach. Provides a cap on certain fees like late fees and prohibits certain fees like pet fees, but arguably not as robust as AB 1248. Finally, I want to highlight one other trend we're seeing that the legislature is trying to respond to, which is using algorithms to engage in price fixing. And there are a number of bills. So as I know you know, RealPage is the name of the company that whose name has come up in this price fixing scheme nationwide. The Biden administration and 8 attorneys general have sued them over their practices, alleging that in something like 1.3 million units throughout the United States, including in California, the 6 largest landlords have engaged in price fixing, which has artificially and through this collusion raised rents to the maximum level, resulting in rapidly escalating rents for those households. So there are 3 bills this year that all have a very similar approach of essentially banning this practice, banning the use of algorithmic pricing. But there's one, SB 52 by Senator Perez, which is focused expressly on rental housing and the practice within rental housing, but also AB 384 by Wahab, AB 325 by Aguirre-Curry, and SB 295 by Hurtado all sort of take on this price fixing scheme and prohibit the use of that method of setting prices. So interesting to see among those 4, which if any or all will move through the process. But I had some indication that the board was particularly interested in that, so I wanted to make sure I raised all 4 of those as bills that are out there dealing with that issue. And then at the outset, I mentioned the bonds. We will see these 2 bond measures move through the House, through both houses. There's one in the Assembly, one in the Senate, with the idea being that they would be on the November ballot in 2026 to provide some additional funding for affordable housing. So let me stop there. That sort of covers the big pieces of what I see as the big 4 themes. Obviously, our report goes over a number of other bills. Happy to answer any questions you may have about anything I've presented or anything you've seen in the report or heard elsewhere. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We do have some questions for you. So I'll start with Vice Chair Ivanov.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
I have 3 questions. So first off, with the affordable housing bonds.
Yeah.
So, as you said, the one coming from the House side, the other coming from the Senate side. Is it essentially the same bill, or do they prioritize different housing projects? They just happen to have the same dollar amount at the top level as a coincidence?
They're largely the same, but there are differences between the two. The 10 billion is a portion between a number of existing programs, like the biggest affordable housing funding program at the state level, not including the tax credit program, is the multifamily housing program. So it puts a bunch of money into that, puts money into the CAL Home program, which funds home ownership, the CERNA Farm Worker Housing Grant Program, and a number of other programs. The goal is that both bills will eventually be the same, but right now, for example, the Senate version put money into the infrastructure grant program, whereas the Assembly version didn't. That seems to have now been resolved through the first committee. But the other thing to note is that so far the Senate bill, which is SB 417, has not been referred to a committee. So the Assembly version is moving, but the Senate has not yet moved their bill. So not clear if both bills will move at this point.
Gotcha. My second question for AB 878, CALRA, reasonable accommodation for survivors in rental housing.
Yeah.
Being the employment lawyer that I am, when I hear the phrase reasonable accommodation, the first thing that I think of is interactive process in a disability discrimination lawsuit, which obviously this is not what this is. So can you just give a little more context on when it's referring to reasonable accommodation, is that just talking about like the victim of domestic violence having access to a comparable unit to the one where the situation occurred, or what kind of accommodations are taking place?
Well, right, and much like in the disability context, it doesn't necessarily define exactly what is a reasonable accommodation, because that's going to be fact specific, but it creates a similar framework for a survivor of domestic violence, that they can seek a reasonable accommodation. So it may be something like, well, state law already provides some mechanism if the person is a member of your household to split up that household and maybe break the lease. The survivor may want to leave, may want to get their security deposit back. But if it's something different, like moving to a different area, breaking the lease early, moving a parking spot, they give a few examples in there. Installing a Ring camera is one example that's actually listed in the statute. So that's the concept, sort of taking that same reasonable accommodation principle and approach and putting it in this context.
Got it. And then my last question, you talked about the 4 price fixing bills going on. So there have already been discussions going on at the city level with our city council about potentially banning this practice.
Yeah.
And so my question is just basically, if any of these 4 bills, get passed and signed by the governor, does that essentially make moot anything that any other locality is doing with respect to this area?
Well, and I'll need to go back and look and see if there is language that protects the locally enacted ordinances, but I think the intention is to have a uniform statewide law. I don't know if that's, San Francisco and Berkeley have also already enacted them, so I'm sure they have some interest in protecting their ordinance if it's stronger. So we'll need to take a look at that and make sure we're keeping that option open. But while we're on that topic, I just want to say if there is interest from the board in taking a position on any of those, because there are 4, what might be useful is to just have some principles about what the outcome of these bills would look like, so that we have some direction as the bills move to figure out if this is the bill that's moving, does it have the features that this board wants to see.
Right. Okay, thanks. That's all I had.
Thank you. Commissioner Leslie.
Thank you. I just had a couple of questions. For SB 522, do you know the outcome of that?
Let me remind, that's the Wahab bill on,
That's for application of TPA to post-disaster.
right, yeah, so that's still moving, but that bill began with 3 components that are triggered when a unit is rebuilt and has been destroyed. 2 of which were, one was, it is an exemption to the new construction exemption in the TPA, so it could still be covered by the TPA, even though it's now a newly constructed unit, because it's replacing one destroyed by fire. And then had the same proposal for the new construction exemption in Costa-Hawkins. It's now just about the TPA just cause protections, that those will apply when the unit is reconstructed.
Okay. So my second question is about AB 299. I just need a little clarity. It says no new tenancy for disaster displaced people in hotels and short-term rentals.
Yeah, so this is a curious one, and I think we're watching this closely because the intent of the bill is good in that, just to give a little context, if a person rents a room in a hotel, there's a practice by the hotel owner to make sure that they don't become a tenant by making them move out, right, within 28 days, so that they don't establish a tenancy after the 29th or 30th day. And this is essentially creating an exemption to that, so that the principle is that hotel providers would not be disincentivized to take in disaster victims who are scrambling to find new housing and may need to stay there longer than 30 days. And the hotel wouldn't want to take them in and allow them to stay longer than 28 days because they don't want to have to create a tenancy, right? So this is creating an exception to that. However, in its current form, it's very open-ended. And so for those who actually do live in hotels or other short-term rentals, and that is their primary residence, they would never be treated as a tenant. So that's a concern, that the bill is going further than what the seemingly, worthwhile public policy of having a short-term fix that allows hotels to take on disaster victims, but we want to separate that from people who are actually tenants and happen to be living in something that's designated as a hotel.
Thank you. I'm glad that they put this on. I've talked to more than a dozen of disaster victims that are living in hotels. And as everyone gives them things to replace the things that they've lost, they've had to move them several times over because of having to move every 28 or 30 days.
Yeah. I think the hope is that this bill can be sort of tweaked to protect those folks, but not harm folks for whom that is their only source of housing.
One last question. Hold on one second. I want to return back to accommodations for survivors in rental housing. Does it say anything about not providing or making them put their names on mailboxes?
That's interesting. No, it's not specifically called out, but that might be an example of an accommodation that would be covered by that, yeah.
Because DV victims, once they move, need to have their residences protected in ways that people that haven't experienced it would never think of.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, okay,
thank you.
thank you.
Commissioner Dudek.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Some of my questions have already been asked, but I have a couple more.
Sure.
I'm particularly interested in SB 436 Wahab, right to redeem. I wonder if you could report on the status. I think it's an important renter protection.
Yeah, and I didn't go over that, so let me just quickly say, what the bill would establish is that a tenant who's facing eviction for non-payment of rent would have the right to pay the outstanding rent at any time up until the sheriff actually locks them out of the unit and restores possession to the landlord, which is some 20-plus states already provide for that, but California does not. And so what typically happens is the tenant, once they're in that unlawful detainer after the 3-day notice has expired, even if they come up with the rent in that time period, they often cannot get the landlord to accept it because they have no obligation to do so, and the eviction goes through even though they could pay the rent and stay in place. So this would create a mechanism that would allow them to do that. It's pending in the Senate Judiciary Committee. Not surprisingly, strong opposition from landlord groups so far on the bill. And there's a lot of moving parts to how it would work functionally. But when we return from spring break, that will get its first hearing, so we'll know more about its prospects then.
I have one more question. Some of us attended what is it? What am I talking about here? The social housing seminar at during the March Housing Conference in Sacramento, and I noticed there's a social housing bond
Yes.
being considered, and I wonder if you could elaborate on it.
Yeah, so Mr. Lee in the Assembly has been one of the leaders on trying to establish a framework for creating social housing, which I'm sure folks know, but social housing is a concept that we're borrowing a bit from Europe, but is both publicly owned, but also has some features of the occupants and tenants have some self-determination that ensures that they have a role in managing the property in addition to having good cause protections and other protections that ensure stability. He's been kind of leading on that. He's put forward the bond to help fund the creation of that social housing model. My guess is that with 4 bonds, there's also a youth housing bond that I mentioned there, that if any of these move, they'll probably kind of be collapsed into one bond bill. And if social housing makes the cut in that conversation, there would be some funding for it. But right now, we're in the very early stages of that.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'll follow up with just a few questions that I have that haven't been asked so far. The first one's on AB 311, the landlord permission to house disaster displaced people. I noticed that some of the provisions, like the landlord has to grant permission for the additional tenant who's been displaced by a disaster. They can be asked to leave within 24 hours notice, and the landlord could charge additional rent. So the first question is like, who's supporting that? Like, what's the coalition supporting that? Because some of those things, while it seems to be aimed to help disaster victims, it's kind of some drastic
Yes.
provisions there.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That one, I think another well-intentioned bill, but the approach is maybe needs some work. Tenant groups have expressed concern about all the things that you've just said, because the ideal policy would be one which is, I think, part of a local executive order in Los Angeles, which is that you can't be evicted for having taken in temporarily a guest or lodger who is escaping disaster. That seems to be the goal here, but that's not what it says, as you just pointed out. One, you would have to get, first of all, you have to have the landlord's permission, so you're already having a conversation that the person's already living there, so you can get their permission, and what if they say no? Secondly, they can charge you additional rent, and that person never has the rights of tenancy, they'll always be treated as a lodger. So that one too needs some work. If the real goal is to say, look, if I took someone in the night after the fire, I can't be evicted for letting them stay with me. And that's the goal, but it doesn't match the language. And I think there's ongoing conversation about making that happen.
Yeah, and also, like, if the landlord's allowed to charge extra rent for that additional person, how, there's a question of how that would relate to, for example, rent-controlled units.
Agreed. Yeah, we're looking at that.
Okay. Then on AB 628 for refrigerators and stoves in rental housing, a similar question, like how that would, does that only apply to new tenancies after that, if that law is signed into, if that's bill signed into law? Because there may be many people in rent-controlled units, for example, or non-controlled units that are existing tenants. Because actually, more precisely, the question is, it says for leases entered into, amended, or extended on or after January 1st, 2026. But I guess my question is really about, it's common practice in Santa Monica that in controlled units, after the initial term of a lease, that you go month to month and there isn't a formal extension, but is that considered an extension?
That's a good point. Let me review it with an eye to that and follow up with your staff about that as well.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great to get more info on that. And I also don't know if our staff has any data on how many units in Santa Monica. Maybe it doesn't seem like, just anecdotally, as common of a practice to not provide a stove and refrigerator in Santa Monica compared to other places in LA, but I've never really seen any stats on that here. I don't know if we have anything like that, but it'd be interesting if you guys can follow up on that.
Another page in Dan's report.
Yeah, it's such a thing that seems to be, again, this is anecdotal, but it seems to be something so specific to California. I hadn't heard of that being from Chicago and living in other states. It doesn't seem like that happens anywhere else that I'm aware of, so. And then lastly, AB 736, the $10 billion bond. Just curious if you have any sense of how much support that has. I noticed that there was a hearing just yesterday. I don't know if you are aware of what took place there, but it seems like there's been a lot of bonds for a lot of different things. Obviously, this is, in my opinion, very worthwhile, but I wonder if there's any sense of fatigue in the legislature about these bonds.
Yes, and I think that is part of the reason that we did see two other bonds, a school bond and a climate bond, go to the ballot last year, and not this bond, even though there was a housing bond in that conversation last year, because ultimately bonds do cost the state some additional ongoing costs, and so there's some political management of how many bonds we're going to put on the ballot, and that's part of the conversation this year as well. Is does leadership and the governor agree that they want to put this before the voters? At the hearing, there was no opposition. Democrats all supported it. One Republican spoke in favor of it, which was somewhat of a surprise to everyone. There was strong support from labor, and of course, a wide array of affordable housing groups and local governments. So there's a lot of support for the idea. The question is, where in the current fiscal situation for the state and other priorities for the ballot does this measure end up falling?
Okay. Well, thank you. I don't think there are any other questions, but we know where to find you if we have questions, and we'll look forward to your follow-up on that. So thank you very much for coming down here.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay, well, that concludes the agenda. Can I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
I move we adjourn the meeting.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, we'll adjourn until our next regular scheduled meeting on May 8th.